So now let's illustrate stakeholder analysis and stakeholder mapping by means of an example. And here you will see the power and interest grid, which is often used in stakeholder mapping. This is sort of the go-to tool in stakeholder mapping that I referred to in the previous video. It's a very neat way of essentially identifying the most powerful, the most influential stakeholders, as well as the stakeholders that have a strong or somewhat of a weaker interest in your business process. This really helps you to prioritize your stakeholders and also define what stakeholder engagement plan you will need. Generally speaking, stakeholders are positioned in this power and interest grid in 4 quadrants. There is the high power, high interest quadrant, which is roughly around here. And this is where you'll find the stakeholders that should be closely managed and engaged regularly. On the other end of the interest axis, you will see the high power, low interest stakeholders. These are the stakeholders that you need to keep satisfied, as well as ensure that they are adequately informed. Even though they have a relatively low interest, they can still make or break whatever you're working on because they are high in power. Low power, high interest stakeholders is the ones that you'll find in this quadrant. These are the stakeholders that you need to keep informed and whose input you'll need for their insights and support. Generally speaking, these are relatively small stakeholders or stakeholders that are not that well mobilized, but they still have a very high stake in your business process. And lastly, there is the low power, low interest quadrant. And this is where you find the stakeholders that you need to monitor from time to time. I do want to point out here that especially if business processes are spread out over a longer period of time, let's say a couple of years, that stakeholder positions could change over time. And this is why it's important to also maintain proper and close relations even with those stakeholders that are low in power and low interest, because they could still change, they could still rise in power, but quite commonly their interest could also change. And this is especially true for the high power, low interest stakeholders. These are the stakeholders that are high in power but low in interest, but over time their interest could still change. And this is quite often what happens, for instance, with governments that are ramping up their regulations, especially if you're working on very innovative technologies that the government didn't foresee. It's not on their radar, but it could happen that within a few years, their interest could change significantly. This is what we're currently seeing, for instance, in the domain of artificial intelligence. Let's now illustrate this by means of a fictional example. The company EcoTech Innovations is a startup that is focused on developing eco-friendly technology solutions for urban environments. And they are planning to launch a new smart recycling bin that uses AI to sort waste and optimizes recycling processes. Before we consider some of these fictional examples, pause this video and think about which stakeholders do you think are relevant here. Try to write them all down. Which stakeholders do you foresee for EcoTech Innovations? And next, try to position them inside this power and interest grid. So now let's consider a couple of fictional examples for EcoTech Innovations stakeholders. At the very top of the power and interest axis, we'll see the investors and the company executives. Of course, the investors are heavily invested with their financial resources in EcoTech Innovations. So they need to make sure that whatever EcoTech Innovations is working on, that they succeed, or else they will lose their money. And Pretty much the same goes for the company executives. They have a strong, even a personal interest in the success of EcoTech Innovations. And they are also powerful. Investors provide the financial backing without which EcoTech Innovations wouldn't be able to run, and the company's executives give their backing to the decisions within the business of EcoTech. On the other end of the interest axis, but still high in power, we'll see the local government and suppliers. These are high in power because a local government could, for instance, ramp up regulations. And suppliers are of course also crucial. They might have a relatively small interest in EcoTech Innovations because typically suppliers work for a wide range of businesses. But if the suppliers are unable to meet the demand of EcoTech Innovations, then EcoTech Innovations will essentially fail. And the same applies to local government regulations. If these regulations stop EcoTech Innovations from actually launching this new innovative technology. At the bottom of the power grid, but still high in interest, we'll see local environmental groups and customers. So customers, of course, are crucial to business success, but generally speaking, they are not well organized, and as such, they are relatively low in power. And the same goes for local environmental groups. They are relatively small in size. It would be different if this is a multinational environmental group such as Greenpeace, but local environmental groups, generally speaking, have quite little clout. So they are unable to really change something for EcoTech Innovations. But of course, both of these stakeholders have a high interest. And lastly, media and competitors. So first, competitors, their power and their interest really depends on the market share. If EcoTech Innovations is really looking to gain a large share of their market, then of course the interest for the competitors would be higher. And the same goes for if these are only 2 or 3 major competitors out there, then generally speaking, they're also higher in power. The media, on the other hand, generally speaking, has no particular interest in whatever EcoTech Innovations is actually doing. The media has its own interest. And that is putting stories out there that people will pay for. And generally speaking, they also don't have that much power, at least not in a direct sense. They might still be able to quite effectively change the public opinion, but generally speaking, they don't have a lot of clout. But you do want the media on your side, because especially as a startup, this is what you need. You need exposure, and you also need positive exposure. So especially if you are a startup, media is generally higher in power, because that article, if it's spinned in a negative fashion, could still break you as a company. So altogether, this visualization really provides another stepping stone for your stakeholder engagement plan. Now you know which stakeholders are most important. And of course, the stakeholder engagement plan really depends on where your stakeholders are in this power and interest grid, but also what kind of stakeholders we are talking about.